Good afternoon and welcome to Birdland Media Works. I'm your host, Danielle Pailly, and today I'm joined by Carl Nudi, a reporter for the Observer News North Manatee edition, who has been in the printing and publishing field for nearly 60 years. From his beginnings as a typesetter for the Detroit Free Press to his later work for the Bradenton Herald, he's watched the evolution of journalism in the newspaper industry as it transitioned from print to the technology age. Our topic today is the changing face of the newspaper industry. Carl, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me today.
Oh, it's an honor. So, Carl, what I found so fascinating about your background as a copy editor and reporter is that you learned your trade through pure experience and on-the-job training versus formal education and an internship like one might expect. In fact, you mentioned to me that you got into journalism through the back door. Can you talk more about that?
Well, what I meant by coming in through the back door is when I started in my career, I was 18 and I started in the composing room of the Detroit Free Press as an apprentice. And back then, composing rooms were places where type was set in metal pieces. The people in the front room or the front of the office were the editors and reporters. So by the time I eventually did make it to the front office, I came from the back room to the front office. So I say I came in through the back door.
And it's so unique because today it's like, okay, where did you go to school? Where did you get your internship? Where did you? So you really learned organically, the old-fashioned way, like jump in with both feet and hope you can swim.
Oh, yeah. Whenever I eventually made it down to the Bradenton Herald, to the front room, or the newsroom, I had no clue. I mean, being around the newspaper and seeing what they did, I knew that that's where the news came from and how they marked up the copy so that I could set it on the linotype machine, but I really didn't know the nuts and bolts of what happened in the newsroom. And when I got hired at the Bradenton Herald back in 1985, I realized that I learned on the job how and what and where everything was.
Yeah. Now, do they have composing rooms today, or are they totally gone?
Oh, there's no such thing as a composing room because of the technology. The thing that would back in the 70s when this, what we called new process was being developed, they called it capturing the first keystroke. So now when a reporter types his story, he's not typing on a typewriter and then it has to be retyped or entered into the typesetting machine, whether it be one like a linotype which casts lead or a photo typesetter. It now is just directly sent to the computer to be designed into a page.
Gotcha. Now, as I understand it, you worked in the printing business for more than 20 years before moving to Florida and eventually becoming a copy editor. What brought you to Florida and why the transition?
Well, I served my apprenticeship and I got my journeyman's card in 1972, and then I was at the Detroit Free Press, but I thought that I should leave the comfort of familiarity of that area where I learned my trade and go and work in some other shops. So I moved around the city and worked in some other shops. Well, because of that, I didn't have any seniority at the Detroit Free Press, and when I eventually came back, I was at the bottom of the seniority list. So in 1981, as newspapers started the trend to reduce the workforce and move all that work that I was doing in the compose room to the front room, I got laid off. And my idea was, heck, it's February 1981, and if I'm going to be laid off, why be laid off in
in Detroit when you could be in Florida on the beach?
Be sunny Florida. I had an aunt that lived in Sarasota, so I decided to move to Sarasota until I got a job in Bradenton, and then I moved back to Bradenton 3 months later.
Right. Now, this made me laugh when you told me this. When you first applied to be a copy editor, you said you weren't even sure what it was, but you were confident you could do it. How did that conversation with the executive editor go?
Wow. Well, I just knew when I saw the ad in the paper, and it was for a part-time, I knew that it had to do something with words. And I went to parochial school, and the nuns made sure we knew our grammar. So I thought, well, I'm good at grammar, I can do it. And then when I got in there, and they have a battery of tests, and I start taking these tests, and I realized I didn't know as much as I thought. So I didn't, when I left, after taking those tests, I didn't think I had the job. And when he called me back, I asked him, I says, well, I didn't think I did very well on the test. And he said, well, you didn't do very well on the test. But on my resume, I put down my experience at the Detroit Free Press with the changing from mechanical typesetting machines to photo typesetting machines. We had a bunch of computers, and I did the programming for the last kind of computer that we had. It was called an ATEX. And the Bradenton Herald just got their ATEX in, and since I knew the programming for it, that's why he hired me.
Yeah. And I've taken some of those tests, so I can sympathize. Like, you think you know your stuff, and there's these little nuances, and with AP style changing every couple of years, what you think you know, you don't know anymore. So it can be frustrating.
Yeah, it definitely is.
So now, I think people take for granted when they pick up a newspaper or log on to their favorite news site how involved a process it is going from finding the important stories to getting it to the masses. Can you briefly share what your work as a copy editor entailed?
It's kind of starts at the beginning of the day you go in, and being that the Bradenton Herald is a morning newspaper, most of the work is done from like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the copy desk, from about 2 o'clock in the afternoon until edition time, which is around 11:30 when I was working. So you go in at 2, and you have your cup of coffee, and then you look at the wires. And this is Associated Press, and at the time, Knight Ridder had a wire service. That was the owner of the Bradenton Herald, which is now McClatchy Newspapers. And there's other, Washington Post has a wire service, and the New York Times wire service. And you look at them, you see a sense of what the stories were trending and what seemed to be more important. And the wire services would send, they sort of put the stories in hierarchy, and so you read the stories, you get a sense of what's going on, and then you start picking the best, like, should I write in the AP story over the New York Times story? And then there's a budget meeting, and at the budget meeting, all the different departments, like the features department, the business department, sports department, and the city desk where the reporters sit, all come together. The heads of those departments would come together, and the executive editor would ask for their ideas of what should be in the paper that day. And at this budget meeting, we know how many pages we have and really how much space we can really utilize for what's important. So then we develop our budget and say, these are the stories. This will be on page 1. This will be inside. This will be on the front cover of the local section. And then once that's all established, different people on the copy desk had different jobs, and one would be in charge of page 1 would be in charge of the cover of the local section, and somebody else would be working on copy that would be in the nation and world, and then somebody else would be doing sports. And so you get the story, and you see what the page layout, what photos are available, and you sort of lay it out to the style of the newspaper so that it looks the same from day to day, but still is an interesting design for the page. And then you, using these computers, you what we call flow in the text into the page and write a headline, attach a photo to it, write the cut lines, and ship it off to the computer that makes the page for the press.
Yeah, so is there a lot of finagling? You get a story that's like you have to cut 150 words to fit in that newspaper, and you spend an hour trying to fit it.
yeah. That's another job is making it fit, and it's it's sometimes like Associated Press writes in the pyramid fashion, meaning that they put the important stuff at the top, and then the rehash stuff that was reported the day before at the bottom. So it's easy to just trim from the bottom, but sometimes you're down to the last line, and you have to get one more line in, so you have to judiciously find that one word that'll suck up the last line.
And I'm pleased to hear that, the movies and television industry hasn't lied to me, where you see people sitting around the table saying, okay, what's the hot topic of the day? And everybody throws out ideas.
Oh, no, there was a lot of, not fights, but discussion about one story being more important than the other, and why it's important for the reader to read this and not read this story. And it was quite it was a highlight of the day to go into the budget meeting.
Yeah. So now, what made you transition into reporting?
Well, I was on the copy desk for 15 years, and we got a new executive editor, and after I guess about a year, she just decided that I should be a reporter.
She decided for you.
Yes, and so she just says, starting Monday, you're going to be covering what we call cops and fire. So I ended up just being a reporter. And I had written a column while I was a copy editor. I wrote a column on fitness, and that was the only writing I did, and it's totally different kind of writing than reporting. So it was quite interesting learning on the job again how to be a writer. I had great mentors. I had a young man that I had trained on the copy desk who went on to be a reporter for us, and he ended up training me to be a cops reporter.
Oh, how cool. And how flexible are you? Today you're going to do this job. Okay.
Yeah, well, if I wanted a paycheck, I couldn't say,
right.
No, I'm not going to do it. So I just went with the flow.
So talk a little bit about your beat.
Well, my first beat was, like I said, cops and fire. So it was, every day going down to the police station and the sheriff's office and looking at the reports. They would put the police officers and deputies' reports. At that time, they were all hard copy, and you would go through them and try to find an interesting story. So it was like hundreds of reports, and you got pretty good at just noticing real quick that this is something different. And so then you would bring it back and try to develop that into a story. In the meantime, somebody or something would happen out on the street, a shooting, a bank robbery or something. So you have to drop what you're doing, run down there and try to observe what's happening on the scene and develop that into a story, and like fire or a big traffic accident. And that was pretty exciting. And of course there was the occasional shooting and murders that were tragic, and at the same time something that you had to write about. And then to try to interview, my toughest thing was interviewing the survivors of a shooting. It just could be quite hard to talk to those people, but you had to do it.
Yeah, particularly at a time when, you just don't know how to approach it, you don't know what to say.
Right. They're going through such trauma, and at the same time, you want to get their reaction and let the readers know how they're doing and what the reader can do for them.
Yeah, but fortunately, you're a very compassionate person, so I think you were able to ask them in a gentle way. So I think you probably did really well in that environment. So you did a lot of work in government writing. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. After I moved from the cops and fire beat, I moved into my first government was all of the islands. And as everybody knows that live in Manatee County, the island of Anna Maria has 3 municipalities, and Longboat Key has 1. So I was covering like four council meetings a month, and planning commission meetings during the month. I was busy at a lot of meetings, but of all the beats that I ended up covering covering the islands was my favorite because I was on the islands every day, just like being in paradise. And then from the islands, I was moved to the Palmetto beat, which was, a little bit larger city than the island cities and a little more complicated issues. And then from there, I went to the Bradenton city meetings to cover that. And eventually I ended up, before I retired, I had about 2.5 years covering the county commission. And all of the government stories was... and articles that I wrote were very interesting. I learned a lot about how our government works and what it takes to get those sewers lines under our streets and the taxes go and how our civil servants serve us. It was a very fascinating and interesting beat for my final years as a reporter.
And it must be hard. In some issues, you probably had strong opinions one way or another, and to be able to take that neutral zone and just report has got to be tough.
It was. They could be making decisions, these different councils and commissions, on issues that I have a strong point of view in. But when you write the story, way I do it is I would let the commissioners or the person that's speaking make the case, and I would just then let my readers make the decision as opposed to trying to put my opinion in.
That's the way it should be, in my opinion.
Well, it's not always that way. There's a lot
that's...
of people that write their stories in a slanted way, and I don't think it serves the public anyhow, in a good way.
That's why I think you're so good at what you do. And I happen to know, and I know you don't want to talk about it, that you've had some pretty prestigious and famous people who wanted you to interview them because they trusted you because you're going to give an honest approach. People appreciate that. So we've talked about this before, and you and I have both experienced journalism as the world moved from print to digital media. What impact do you think this has had on the industry and the way we receive news?
It didn't happen overnight, but it seems like it did. But over the time of my experience in the newspaper, being that the newspaper was able to put the latest news quickly because of the new technology into the paper, people were getting information quicker. And then the 24-hour news cycle happened with CNN and Fox, so people were expecting more from the newspapers. I think that this quickness, though, can be detrimental to the reader because it doesn't give them a chance to digest what they read. I mean, now we get our news as it's happening. We're watching live Facebook posts of shootings or something, and we could either get inured to it, or our emotions are not the same as whenever we had a day or two to think about it before we read about it. So I'm not sure that it's the best way, but that's the way it is. So we're just going to have to develop our society to react to it in whatever way we do.
Yeah, and I know in your work you do your fact-checking, but I can't tell you how much online people are trying to get things out so quickly, and you wonder where they get their information because you see a lot of conflicting details about the same story, where somebody is in such a rush to get the story online that there are errors, and then they have to go back. You go back a day later and they say, oh, we printed this, but we meant to say this.
Oh, yeah. I see that a lot. And I'm not saying that us in the newspaper industry never got our facts wrong, and we do correct them when we do, because you see there's that one spot in the newspapers called corrections, and you'll see that we'll try to correct it. But we have longer time to develop our story because we have the edition time and deadlines. But today they want that story as you write it, and errors can be happening.
Yeah. Now, I know for the most part you were an advocate of getting info online, not just in print. Were there people that you worked with reluctant to make that transition?
Well, I don't know if they were reluctant, but on both sides, the management was slow in doing that because of the cost. And I'm not so sure that they saw the changes so quick. And even as I'm telling them that this is coming down the pike, because I've been in new technology from the early 70s when I learned how to program, And I kept telling them this is happening, and but it's either the cost or they just were stuck in their, oh, we've done it this way for 100 years, we'll continue doing it. And then on the newsroom employee or reporter and editors, they had that attitude, well, this is the way we always did it, so, you know. So I would tell them, well, if you don't change with the times, somebody else will be coming in doing your job, and we see that's happening.
Yeah, and actually, to your point, I mean, in addition to your skill as a writer and an editor and a designer, is your ability to adapt to change. And you touched on this a little. Do you think it's dangerous for anyone in the news industry to get caught up in one way of doing things without being flexible?
Without a doubt, you have. It is dangerous. You have to be flexible in the news industry. It just shows that even just covering a story. I mean, here I am when I was covering cops. I'm writing this story about this purse snatcher at the mall. Then all of a sudden there's a bank robbery. Well, I have to be able to drop that and switch gears, and I'm covering bank robberies, not purse snatchings. Well, that's what you have to be with technology. You have to be able to go with what's going to get the story out to the reader, whatever technology, whether it's going to be Instagram, where just a couple years ago it was Twitter, you know, so.
Yeah, and you almost have to be ahead of the curve, because just when you think you've learned something, there's something new. So if you're reluctant and you wait 6 months, you're behind.
Right, exactly.
So I remember you initially retired in 2010. And you resurfaced a short time later, because I think reporting's just in your blood. So what's next for you?
Well, right now I'm still writing one story a week for the Observer News, which is a Ruskin newspaper that has a North Manatee edition, and I write the main story for the North Manatee edition. And right now that's good for me, being I'm retired. I still have my hands into the writing part, and the best part is reporting, where I get to meet wonderful people and interesting people and go to events. So that looks like for the future that's what I'll do until they either decide they don't need my services, or I'm tired of writing. So
I don't see that happening anytime soon. Can you tell us is there a unique story that you covered that you really loved?
There was this one story that it was one of my favorite stories to cover. Right here in Allington is a couple, Renona and David Myers, who were freedom riders back in the early 60s. Wow. And the unique thing is they're both white, and yet they thought the cause of equal society was so important that they joined the Freedom Riders. And I wrote a story back in 2001, I think it was, about them, and I was just so moved by their story. They're just very interesting people. Winona, matter of fact, has the distinction of being the longest held. She was held the longest in jail for refusing to take the bail when it was offered. So she stayed in jail for close to 6 months for violating the law of associating with. What she did was, I guess, rode in the black section of a bus, and so she was arrested.
Oh wow, that must have been an amazing story.
You're
going to have to send me a copy now so I can read it. Now, one last question for you: what can future writers expect? Because a lot of times people have this very TV idea of what it means to be a writer, and when they get in and dig in deep, they maybe don't like it as much.
One thing I think what's coming around is not having the respect that writers used to have. I think with all that's coming down the track with politicians saying it's fake news, people don't trust what a reporter is going to write is going to be what they think should be written. So that's going to be the toughest row for them. But also finding places for your writing to be disseminated. I mean, like, anybody can write anything, start their own blog, and some people have become quite successful. So, but to work for a company, there's fewer and fewer companies that are publishing other people's work. So
Yeah, you have to be really creative sometimes in getting your foot in the door.
Yes, definitely.
Carl Nudi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.